Okay, thank you so much for joining on such short notice. We know that we agreed to have this as a recurring meeting on Mondays for at least the next 6 weeks, but because the next Monday is already vacation in US, so we decided to make it, like this week as well. If you can allow me, I will share my screen and then we can start. So this is the place that we are holding the agenda and the action items. I will share it in the chat right now. Please feel free to add any action items, any agenda items. Otherwise, we can start with the first one here, which is, just 1 second. Yes, which is the agenda now is I will discuss my proposal, and Wojtek and Eric, please go ahead with your proposal as well, and then we can try to figure out how to get the best out of these two proposals, and then Kevin has an action item as well. Any objection? Anyone wanted to do anything to have anything before starting? Okay, so basically in this proposal, I have two options that are trying to address all the problem that we've talked about in the last meeting from the integration point of view, and basically. We have the pod group is immutable right now, which breaking the scaling problem in many APIs, and there's the workload lifecycle is a little bit hard now because we don't to be able for every true controller to manage the workload lifecycle. It seems like we need to duplicate a lot of these fields, which I feel like it's not sustainable, because every time we are adding new field to the workload, we have to go to every single true workload to add it as well. And also specifically for the job controller, we stuck in a problem, which is the suspended job as well. It was a little bit blocker on how to integrate the workload with the suspended job, because the fields are, the pod group wasn't immutable, and lots of other problems as well. So because of this, I had two proposals. The first one was a little bit, not new, but it's really different from what we have in the Workload API right now, which is basically having the workload as a static class, similar to the storage class, for example, or priority class. It will have just the policies for the scheduler or any other policies that we would like to add. And then the pod group will be a runtime object. So user cannot control it, user cannot update it, anything user wanted to add or wanted to configure, it will be through the workload. And then the controller, the true controller, will create the pod group with all the details related to this controller. The workload, because of this, will be just a static object, so there is no status needed for this, as far as I imagine it, but all the status will be on the pod group itself. For example, let's have another little bit complicated example, which is the LWS. So for the LWS, for example, if we have the leader and the worker templates, we will create two workloads. The first workload for the leader with all policies related to it, and similar for the workers, and then the controller will create list of bot groups according to number of replicas in this leader worker set. I went through the main or maybe the most important APIs and applied this option on all of them, making sure to just it is working or not. It's just like a quick, not POC, but like not POC from the code, but from the requirement itself. And of course, because the Elastic job is really like a special case, I went through it and discovered a couple of problems or couple of blockers, which I started to, discuss the options during this proposal on how to solve it. And actually, this is why I discovered, we can have the second option. And this is why I started to think about the second option that I will discuss with you right now. I can see John and Eric has their hands. John?
Yeah, I just wanted to, so the way, and I hope this doesn't cause more confusion because I'm trying to reduce confusion, but from my point of view, like the way we've been discussing workload and workload aware scheduling up until now, the workload is kind of this larger thing that is composed of pod groups. The way you're using the term, it's more like a class or a set of scheduling policies that apply to some subset of the pods. So in my mind, I'm translating when you say workload to like pod group scheduling policy, or pod group class, or pod group scheduling class, or something like that.
Yeah.
And the word class, just like consistency throughout the rest of Kubernetes from an API standpoint, the word class generally has a very distinct meaning of like, right, exactly what you're saying. It's static. It's just a grouping of policy. It can be referenced by other things, but it doesn't like generally have a status unless, I mean, in some cases it could, but generally doesn't have a status. The status isn't associated with a particular usage. It's cluster scoped, not namespace scoped. So I just want to make sure, like, are you suggesting in this case these would be cluster scoped, or would they still be namespace scoped because they contain a lot of detailed policy? I guess it's not, maybe we don't need to go into it here. It's not that important, but I just kind of raising as we evolve these APIs, those are some of the questions we have to answer.
Yeah, I envision it as a namespace scope, not cluster scope. We can have it as a cluster scope. And actually, I discussed this here with the default workload, or, like workload class, as you mentioned. So I envision that as we can create a namespace, like default namespace for each controller. This namespace can be like per cluster or per node or per namespace, and otherwise user can define their own workload to override this. Yeah, and of course it doesn't have any status as you mentioned. And there's a lot of details. I don't want to go through all the details here because of the time, but basically this is a gist of the idea. It's static. Like it doesn't have anything related to bot group itself, or like it's just policies. Let's say that it's just policies, as simple as that. And the controller will just figure out how the pod group will look like according to these configurations, and the true controller will be responsible for the lifecycle. This is the first proposal. Eric. We cannot hear you.
Can we talk a little bit more about the, I guess you call them problem statements? So can we kind of agree on what scaling looks like today and what you want it to look like? Okay. So today, you would be able to create it. Let's just talk about job because it's simple. You can make a job that's gang scheduled, and you could specify min count of 10, and you could later decide, gosh, I sure would like to have 12 running, and you could start 12, 2 more, and that's not mutating workload, and the scheduler should try to place those, and the workload could discover that it has peers by like periodically pinging DNS addresses that are like higher than the count. We could add some kind of like update flow where it like where the job controller notices it and send, I don't know, like so like first of all, designing scale up for something that has indexes is I guess covered by Elastic Job. I haven't read that, but like I guess I'll stop talking and tell me like why doesn't it work? Or why doesn't the naive thing of just adding more pods work? Why do we need to increase min count?
Okay, how the gang scheduler plugin will handle more pods related to the job. So for now we have only the min count, right? We cannot update the min count.
Min, but it's not so. But you're allowed to make more than min.
Of course,
the scheduler is allowed to start them.
Yeah, but the workload in this case, the status for the workload will be running or done, right? Because once we achieve the min count, the min count is the
we haven't designed workload status yet. Yeah. We haven't designed workload status yet. Clearly, any object that supports updates is going to have a complex state status section, right?
Yeah. So actually, I'm sorry, Andrea. I'm already working on the status design as well, and this is why I'm seeing the problem now. So once we started to think about the status, it will be really complicated now because we don't know, if the new pod that just created is part of this gang or not. We need to track this. And we need to, we don't know, the gang scheduler already is running, right? The gang scheduler for the minimum of 4 pods is running now. When we have a new pod, how can we say that the pod group will be now, like the min count will be 5? Or how can we translate this?
I don't, sorry, from my perspective, and my question is different, but I don't think we need to go to the state machine complexities, because I think I agree with Eric, different controllers will have a different state machines, and different controllers might define them differently. So we can find a way to tell users that is why I think in one of the proposals I suggest maybe we introduce desire count to the pod groups. So then we have a min count and desire count up to what it can be scheduled. And then we can also show the status in which phase the pods are right now. Because state machine can be very complex. Yeah. And, I don't think we should go there.
I agree. It becomes very, very complex, and
the state machine can say whether or not the condition has been met, that the minimum have been scheduled, and the state machine can also say the count that it currently thinks are scheduled. Now, you can make a point. There's a point that if we have a lot of pod group replicas, like the status gets confusing. So, like, I'm definitely interested in proposals that separate out pod group. I just don't think it's accurate to say that you can't support any elasticity with the current proposal, and that you have to delete workloads to get elastic behavior. I don't understand that claim.
Okay, so you do not understand the claim that. Okay, so let's go back again. I agree with Andrea. We need to have like a desired number of pods. Otherwise, how can we say that the new pod is related to the gang schedule that is running right now?
Because it has the same workload and pod group in its workload ref section, so we know it's related because it's in the pod.
But the pod group is immutable right now. We cannot update anything in this.
The pod says what pod group it belongs to. You don't have to mutate the pod group to create another pod that references it.
Okay, all right, so how about the scaling problem right now for the large workload? Like we have like 1,000 or 100, like 10,000 of pod groups. How this can happen now?
I think maybe, and I know Yuki also on the call, I think we have the elastic policy in the PyTorch job. And if I remember correctly, we do have min and max count there, which means users, before they submit the workload, should know or up to what number of GPUs their workloads can scale, which means that they can configure min count and desired count beforehand, unless we have any other use cases that I'm not aware of that, you can dynamically scale to up to any, number.
There is actually a case that you're saying, hey, like scale up to, like as long as you can. So it's like going some sort of recursing. So this gang group or the pod group just create n number of it. So it becomes a little bit complicated. So let's get a little bit back to this point. So in some cases, I'm trying to create the same gang scheduling multiple times, and I need to have the min and desired numbers, and for n number of times, like creating it for n number of times. And the current workload, I cannot see it. I cannot see how this will happen, and how can I track it, and like report the status for the workload and the pod group as well. Dominic? You're muted, Dominic.
Sorry. So we indeed should think about desired count, because currently number of pods that exist define desired count. So we may have 2 pod groups and each two pod group replicas, and each of them has different pod numbers. And currently it's not a problem. But if we want to write the desired count into pod groups, we need to write it into those 2 different replica objects. Because desired count will be different in one replica and it will be different in another replica.
Okay.
Is desired, I'm confused, is desired an intent, or is it a
it's not well defined, but I think we mean desired intention. And the actual would be probably reflected in the status.
Okay. I think the min count means that the minimum number of pods that we can say the gang scheduler can be scheduled, but it's not the desired. It's the bare minimum that we will say, hey, the gang is ready, right?
Currently desired is defined by the number of pods that indeed were created, but it's
not explicitly set. It's set by observation today, because everything is done that way today. But it sounds like we're trying to shift that. Not everything, min isn't, but
okay. So let's try to apply the like what we're saying on this example right now. I have a workload, and it has minimum for min count equal 4, and I have a job, and the parallelism for the job is 16. Okay, and this is an elastic job. So basically, I wanted to reach to the like 16 pods, and I wanted to know like every 4 pods, it's like a pod group, right? So I wanted every 4 pods to create, or like to form a new gang. Is that right? How can we do this with the gang scheduler right now, with what we have right now, Eric?
Say one more time. Like, so we have talked about desired count. We talked about max count. Mm-hmm. Max makes sense. I don't know if those are the same thing. What Torch, like telling the scheduler how many you need, we all agree that saying I need the minimum amount before I should start makes sense. A max count would make sense in the sense that maybe it's called desired, I don't know, but you can give another number that's larger than min, which says when you look for a topology domain to place me in, try to find, if there's multiple choices, try to pick one that will let me scale up larger. Now, with only gang scheduling, that doesn't really, there's max count wouldn't have any meaning, but when we have TAS, I definitely think that max count would be a good thing to add. And so there'd be like 3 cases. So one case is a job that doesn't scale, and you just need to set min count, and that's equal to max count. The second case is you set min and max, and then you start with some, and then the number you create is somewhere between those two, and you're still guaranteed to be able to, or have a high probability of placing them. I don't know what guarantees you get when you ask for more than min, though. Or you don't specify max, and then you make extra pods, and they maybe get placed. So I think
Okay.
max are desired, as far as I can tell. All it does is make it slightly more likely that additional pods will be successfully placed. But I don't know that it like sets aside nodes for you, like at the time of creation of the workload. Something else is going to run there, and it's up to the scheduler to determine like how hard it should try to let you get more than min later. If you really want min, like take it now. We don't want to introduce something that lets you ask for more in the future, but then not use it, because that's like seems wasteful to me. Maybe people disagree.
Okay, so in this case, I wanted to have like the max desire 16. How, like without the max, I think it would be really hard for us to know that, like we already achieved the 16, because there's nothing, like there's nothing from scheduler perspective communicate this information to the scheduler. Is that right?
Well, all the pods are running, and so they try to talk to each other, and then they discover each other, and they determine that they're up, right?
Okay, but I wanted to inform the user that this job is running now. Like it's running successfully now. All jobs has been scheduled as a gang.
I don't think the scheduler knowing the state machine of the job, as Andre said, is like that's not in scope for this project. Unless we could have a thing where we have an additional protocol in like conditions exist in workload, and we give guidelines for how schedulers should set conditions into workload status according to some like generic workload status that we define. That'd be nice because it'd make all workloads similar, but that hasn't been proposed yet. And I don't think that relates at all to like min count, really. It would more be the state machine would still be in the true controller, and we would just be providing like an abstraction, which maybe is kind of close to what you're proposing. No, I think your proposal did not have status in workload.
It has.
If you want,
this one doesn't, because
okay,
it would be just a static class. So there's no status here. All the status will be in the pod group. I will pause, and Kevin, please, Kevin and Andre.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so for Elastic Job right now with workload, the behavior would be that, like in this case, like let's say, whatever the workload is for, like I can scale down, or sorry, basically we're gonna create a workload with whatever the parallelism, whatever the min count is, and you can always go below that, and then all of those pods will start running, and then if you go above that, it will just, you're basically guaranteed to only place like the, in this case 4 pods have to be scheduled for the gang to be satisfied. Anything else like that is extra. And like I guess the main issue with Elastic Job is that it isn't great in the sense that like we are giving a guarantee of the gang at the creation of the workload, and like if like let's say I go from 100 parallelism down to 0, which is in scope for Elastic Job, their workload will still be stuck with 100 pods as it expects. And if I scale up to like 1, that's fine, and it will still schedule. It's just like the workload is unfortunately pointing to an outdated parallel. Like if we assume like a gang must, like for a job is parallelism is equal to min count, once you do the Elastic Job scaling down or up, things won't be that anymore. But I think I haven't really gotten a clear answer from folks that proposed this KEP about like who was the targeted. Like I don't actually know who is the target audience for this feature, because like for job set, we don't yet have support for Elastic Job sets, and I don't know if anyone is currently using Elastic Index Job at the moment. So I'm not sure how important this is to solve right now, to be honest. And yeah, to answer Eric's question, yeah, it's a elastic index job. I can find the KEP. It's probably a small. Basically, the requirement is if you have an index job, you can change parallelism and completions together, and you can scale up or down at will. And I think that's the only thing that we allow changing in the job. And I guess the question does become around gang semantics around there is, right now we would just say it's whatever the workload was when the person created it is what is guaranteed to schedule. So if you go way above, it doesn't matter because it satisfied the gang constraint.
Kevin, since you know where this KEP is, would you mind asking the KEP promoter to define what they would like the gang behavior?
I sent a message to Abdullah.
Or...
Abdullah and some other person from Google proposed it, but I know he doesn't work at Google anymore. So I did send a message to some of the job set folks on this one, but I haven't got a response yet.
Edwin was on. Edwin, I wonder if Edwin knows. Or no, I guess Edwin dropped. Okay.
Sorry,
right.
I'm here. So is your question specifically around the use case for Elastic job set, Kevin?
More for Elastic Index job. Like when it was proposed a few years ago, and I was just trying to understand what was the use case for it and whether or not some of the questions are, yeah, and that was really kind of what I was trying to understand because I'm struggling to find frameworks that really actually support this that are used right now.
Yeah, so for just
Go
really for job set, we do have internally at Google, we have some products that do elastic training that build on job set. And then they did initially have an ask to us to be able to scale up and down the number of replicas in the replicated job or the replicated jobs themselves dynamically. But right now, their workaround is they just delete and recreate the job set with a different number of replicas. So we don't have any concrete requirements from them because that workaround seems to work fine for them for Elastic Job Set at the moment. And I don't have any plans to add that support until there's a good use case. So yeah, I don't know that we necessarily have a reason to do Elastic Index Job right now. At least for job set. I don't know about LWS or other controllers.
We actually, we do have a strong use case on Elastic Job Set, and hopefully, we can find contributors to, support it in Job Set. And I think it's pretty, obvious for me how we can do this in PyTorch. I think I just want to maybe say 2 points on the elasticity part. I think that I linked the doc on the PyTorch site, and there are a couple of frameworks in open source which support elasticity. So in PyTorch, in a torch run, you have to specify a min and max count before you start a job, and then you can configure your rendezvous in a way that you can add more groups to their I think they also call it the pod groups, not pod groups, but the grouping mechanism, right? So there is a way in a PyTorch to do so. I also know Horovod supports as well such capabilities, and there are some other things as far as I know with the API where you can add more nodes to the running job. As far as I know, also VLLM using Torch Run for some inference capabilities, which means you still have these limitations in the way, where you need to specify min and max count before you run the job. The only one use case I might be aware of where you don't need to specify the max count is the Spark. So Spark has a feature which is dynamic resource allocation, which allows Spark to, add more executors when it understands that it needs more CPU to perform, data processing tasks. But I don't know if you want to go towards these use cases because the folks who are running Spark don't really use jobs, as far as I know. So they don't use this elastic job feature. So that's the point I want to say on elasticity.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
For the elastic job, do we need to specify how large the pod group would be? Like if we have 16 pods, I need the gang to be for each 4 pods. It's like the size of the pod group.
Yeah, in the torch run, right? So
Yeah.
torch run has the min and max value in number of nodes. So you have to set it before you kick off the torch run process.
And inside the min and max,
Yes.
do I care if the, like four of them has been, like ganged together, or the 16 of them has been ganged together, or the max number of pods has been ganged together, or subset of them has been ganged together? Do I care about this?
So torch run doesn't have such, detailed settings, right?
Mhm.
So torch run basically has a min and max value, which you specify, and then create a group of GPUs which performs the training, right? And then you can add more, ranks to your grouping cluster, right?
Okay.
Yeah, which means like you want to have maximum, you will desire to have maximum of the gangs, but if you don't have some sufficient resources, in min also works, right?
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Yuki?
Yeah. So as Andre mentioned, Elastic job has training workload use cases. But let me complement the background, the reason why we introduced Elastic job index job into our Git control manager. Actually, so I worked with Abdullah when we introduced in the Elastic jobs. So actually, so the same use cases as Andre mentioned, Horobot MPI job, Elastic Pilot job. However, these days, I'm not sure if this use cases is proper use cases in the world. Yeah, just mention that. Let me just mention this.
Thank you. Eric?
Question for Andre. Would you, I assume you don't want your pods to be preempted when let's say you have min 8, max 16, and then you make 8 pods and they're running for a while, and then later you do, like someone updates your PyTorch job to like say they want 16. Do you ever want the original 8 pods to get preempted, or you definitely want those to stay up, or do you not care? And would you say like I'll tolerate being preempted if it means I get 16, or with 16 I cannot scale? What do you want to have happen? Like in scarce resource situations, what semantics do you want?
Yeah, I think so. Torch run has some sort of toleration capabilities. So if you can preempt, so because like I'm not 100% sure if you can preempt gangs from already running cluster in PyTorch, because the question is like if you have, for example, 5 GPUs, if you preempt one, will torch run will still continue? Because like then the PyTorch, I think they have to by default using this rendezvous capabilities because torch run has its own scheduler, right? And it also needs to know how to add group pods or like GPUs to the cluster and how to remove it. So I know the PyTorch also has the torch fault tolerance framework, but we don't really explore this yet. But in terms of preempting the pods, we need to really see if PyTorch supports this. Because if not, otherwise you cannot really, I mean, in that case, you cannot really preempt pods that
Do we
which
have to
will
like
be in the
restart from
bank.
checkpoint or something and like talk like
Yeah.
yeah, so it's not desirable. But like what would you want to have happen if you like someone edits PyTorch to set the job's true controller spec to say I want to go to 16 now, but like the schedule's like I don't have any more pods for you for a long time. Like how should that be surfaced to the user in your controller resource?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, and this should surface via min and max count, right? I start my job with a min count, available GPUs. If I have more GPUs to be, like to be preempted, you will give me more GPUs, so my job, can be complete faster, right? Can be completed faster. Like myself I as a user expect to allocate as much capacity as you have, right? So like my job will, I think it's expectation of any user, right?
I see.
But,
So you don't. There's not like a third. There's not like a third field called replicas that says like what I currently want. It's not that you're using like an HPA to scale it up and down. You're just saying I would love to have 16. Please give me 16 if you can, but I'll still start with just 8. And if you add them later,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
fine.
yeah. Because it's better to
It's
start
not
with
a third
something.
field.
Yeah, it's better to start with something than just not starting at all, right? Because we want jobs to be completed as fast as we can. However, like on inference, like it might be more complex. I'm not, but the thing is like inference still using torch run. this is the case, right? Like VLM behind the scenes still, I know sometimes they're using Ray, and I'm not an expert there. We need to maybe ask some folks from working observing, but they're still using torch run to kick off inference pipelines, right? So we need to see, like, yeah.
Min, desired, and max are actually, to me, are three different concepts. Min is what you need to have start. Now, desired is like, if while you're starting me, you find out you could do more than min, you can do desired, please start me with that. And then max would be like a promise about future mutation of like will pods come later, far after initial start time. So I guess desired is most relevant, would be correspond to your max, because it's a one-time decision as opposed to like provisioning for possible future requests.
There's also the use case where you might be running with something and like you have a bad hardware, something fails, and then you want to run with fewer replicas. So I don't know if it's like a one-time decision.
Yeah. Okay. So there's like an allowed range. That seems like that's more important than like any kind of HPA driven use case. Like no one wants to connect. So I guess the question would be for Yuki and Andre: did anyone ever try to want to attach an HPA to one of these things? And the answer is, I think, is going to be no.
So as far as I know,
sorry, go on, Yuki.
Oh, sorry. As far as I know, previous Python job B1 leverage a horizontal autoscaler resource.
Yeah.
I mean, so when HPA controller detected so limited CPU resources and memory in cluster, they try to expand, scale out, scale in Python replicas. So is this answer from your question?
Yeah, it's right. We're creating HPA on the controller. We need to see actually if we scale down, not only up. This we need to probably take a look on the controller side.
Okay, so you're saying that people do want to use HPA to somehow vary between min and max based on.
I think it's not about what people want. I think it's more about what we be capable, a couple of years ago to have some elasticity, right? Because we do have this horizontal pod autoscaler API, then we just use it to, give folks some elasticity, right? But it's up to us to decide what API might look like, right?
Okay. One more question, Eric, if you don't mind. For the AWS, in the current workload, we will provide or create two pod groups, maybe one for the leader, one for the worker, right? And we will set a min count for each one of them, or just one pod group, okay? So one pod group, it's like one leader and 4 workers, for example, something like that. And we will
need to have like at least like you're not going to start a leader with no workers. That's a waste of a leader, right? Although, but you might. I mean, in the schedule internals, if the leader uses a GPU, like sometimes the leader and the workers are identical except for like a command line argument. The scheduler doesn't care. So what we'll do is we'll compute that all those have the same signature. We put them in what we call one pod set, and then we'll just treat internally be treated as if it were a single boring pod group. Other cases where I've seen sometimes where the leader only uses CPU and has totally different resource footprint than the coordinator. Yeah. In that case, the scheduler needs to figure out what is the harder thing to place and place that first. And that's pretty much always going to be the workers, because the more scarce resource is the GPUs. So then it'll go place the workers, and then it will probably try to place the leader, and then I guess those will all get started.
So with
you don't want to start until they're all ready. So that would still be one gang, because a gang is the unit of atomic success, like placement or not placement.
But so they're all one gang. But like when we get to TAS, like is the policy different? Like would you want all the workers? Do we require that the leader be in the same topology, or is the leaders sort of just
We
control
may.
mechanism, and it doesn't necessarily need to be in the same topology. Do we care? I mean, that's making it way harder. So like maybe we're just like live with that. But I'm just saying, like, if
I think the most important feature to deliver for this to be useful is that you just have TAS period, and that it works with the case where leaders and workers all need to be in the same domain. And then a further refinement later is to have like exclude index 0 from TAS requirement field or whatever. Like, and then that's a small optimization.
Okay. I have a question related to the leader worker set as well. So the first use case, it's good. Like I have one worker, everything is the same. All of them will be running either in GPU or CPU. They have the whole requirement. That's okay. But in case of having different requirement, I cannot see how to say, hey, the leader which is running in CPU, and the worker which is running on GPU needs to be together, like needs to form. What is the relation between these two pod groups right now? Because we will have to have two pod groups, right?
No, they're one pod group still. Are you talking about RL, or are you talking about the like coordinator and worker pattern?
The worker pattern. Yeah, coordinator and worker pattern.
Like, as defined today, gang scheduling doesn't care if every pod in the alpha API allows you to have every pod have a different shape. Like, that's allowed. And today the scheduler will, for gang scheduling, it will try to do that. And for the TAS that's been proposed in the CAB by Pavel, and I think Dominic knows a lot about that too, like that will work if all pods are different shapes. So yeah.
The pod would be in different shape, but now I have in this example, for example, the leader worker job, we have two different templates. Okay, one for the leader, one for the worker. It has different requirement at all. Like
I don't know why you wrote it that way. I mean, yeah, you wrote something that I wouldn't have written.
Actually, sorry, Rick, it will be the use cases when there are two different templates.
I saw it in multiple places actually.
Yeah, like for Spark, it's maybe use case for distributed data cache, the one I mentioned before.
No, I mean, I agree that the leader, everything is fine, except I wouldn't have had two different workload refs. I would have had one workload ref to the same name. It's just the difference between the names that I'm disagreeing with. Everything else looks fine.
This is the new proposal that I'm this is
okay.
I'm applying it to the new proposal.
Think of that as pod group scheduling policy, not workload. That's what I was saying in the beginning.
Exactly.
It's a shift in the word workload that's different than what we've been talking about up to now.
Exactly.
Roman's been waiting a long time, by the way.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, just wanted to ask if both the leader and the workers are in the same pod group, then it means that the min count is always equal to the number of all the pods together, right? Because we must guarantee that the leader is scheduled. Workers without leader cannot do any work.
And we don't know what is the min for the leader and min for the worker. We don't know. We don't have this information anywhere.
Like, I think you're saying, like, yeah, I don't think we can support if you made, there's nothing in the implementation today. If you have like min count 10 and you make 11 pods, there's nothing to prevent the case where it decides not to schedule the leader. So I'd say for that case, don't make more pods than min count. I actually wanted to call it count initially because of that reason, but yeah.
I think Roman, please Roman, correct me. We have we have the same min count for the leader and the worker, and we don't know what is the min count for the leader alone and for the worker alone. So for the pod group with min count 4, we need just 4 pods for whatever. Right? Yes. So it can be 2 leaders, it can be 2 workers, it can be 1 leader, 3 workers, 4 workers. We don't know. We don't have this specifications anywhere. Is that right, Roman?
Well, right now you don't really have any choices here because you want them to be gang scheduled, so they have to be in a single pod group, right?
Yeah.
If you put them in two pod groups, it's possible that only the leader is scheduled or only the worker. So they all of them in the same pod group. Then you have only one min count.
Yeah.
And as Eric said, it means that the number of pods is actually equals to the min count. That's the only choice right now. I also wanted to ask if there are any thoughts of how it will be solved in the future. There are, or maybe we can leave it for now because there are ways to solve it.
If we added indexing and you want your leader to be index 1, then we would promise that we would only, like if we would start from 1 and then densely schedule them initially. And if there's any case where you want your leader to be a different index differently, like maybe because that's how LWS works or something, then we would probably need to have two pod subgroups, one with a size of 1, and then we'd have to have a min count 1 additionally which would basically say there's a pod group min count. There's also another min count in the pod subgroup that says, in addition, you definitely have to schedule at least one of these in the leader one. Then you have another pod subgroup for like the other indices. And then those would not have an additional min count. So I think it's modelable with the concepts that were proposed in the pre-alpha
in the original design. Yeah. So in the suggestion that you said, the last one, it means that pod group is scheduled when all the subgroups are scheduled within it.
Right? Yes, and if there's pod subgroup to me implied indices, and so like if you create pods, like in the Elastic case, like you have min of 8, and suppose we support min and max initial values, and you have like indices 1 through 16, we won't go like 1, 4, 3, 5, 7. Like we promise not to do that. But we have to, I think it's somewhat urgent we need to add indices soon so that we can start implementing that type of behavior. And so the long pole there is to add an index field into pod resource itself so that people can start, rather than using labels as different labels for different controllers, in addition, they can start putting index into pod. But we have to agree on that's an index of what? Of the workload of the pod group, of the pod subgroup, blah, 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 blah. That needs to be defined.
That's for the future.
Okay. And we don't support index stateful sets, right? Like how are you going to assign the index?
Yeah. Stateful sets have a number in there. Stateful sets always have an index, right? There's a number, there's a label for stateful sets that tells you what its index is, and it's part of the name. Maybe I'm misremembering, or maybe it's changed, but
yeah, we need to see because index jobs was introduced quite recently, right? I'm not sure about stateful sets, but
okay. Stateful sets had an index from the beginning because it's how it guarantees if you have the ordered option, it's how it guarantees the ordering.
Yes, they always do have an index.
Yeah, actually, index job concept came from the stateful concept.
Okay, so time check. Sorry for that. We might be late, so appreciate if if you can just stay a little bit longer. All these discussions that we had led to my second proposal, which I will go through it very quickly, so I can leave discussion for Eric after that. So we've talked about how to have multiple pod groups know what's going on between each other, like the LWS. We've talked about the replica index, and we've talked about other other the DRA integration and stuff like that. So the second proposal that I had, which contained the workload as we have right now, but instead of having list of pod groups, we will have list of pod group templates. And why template? I will get back to it in a while, in a bit. But the pod group template will have a min count, and it will have its own DRA resource. Sorry, it will have its own DRA or resource claim template, and we can override specific replica So it's for example, because this was an issue actually open for the current design that we have right now for the workload, that sometimes I wanted replica 0, or like the first replica, to have longer timeout, or like other specifications or other configuration. So I just introduced this override replica configuration, and then we can have multiple pod templates on one work group. And if we wanted them to be depending on each other, for example, the LWS case, we can have some sort of scheduling affinity rules, which says, hey, this is a gang by itself. So the leader and worker has to have at least minimum number of count on each bot template together, so we can call this as a gang. And of course, the status here, I just had some status here to be able to apply it for different workloads. And I went a little bit further and proposed how we can say this is gang of gang, which it's a little bit complex use case. So, for example, here, because again, this comes from some issues open for for the current Workload API. They had this requirement, which is, hey, we have a disaggregated inference, which has this number of coordinator has to be up, this number of workers has to be up, and so on. So how we can make this happen? So for the proposal I just introduced, we can do this now. So we can, form two gangs, based on a couple of pod groups templates, and we can have other requirements as well, which is, hey, this gang must, all of them has to be up and running, or maybe any of them. This is totally fine. Or again, for the multi-gang mode, we can have it sequential, or we can have it in parallel. And I added an example here for each one of them. I already discussed the lifecycle workflow for the the main workflows that we wanted to support, and I applied them for the main controller that we wanted to support, which is the LWS and job set and jobs. And actually, the second one solved a lot of problem that was limitation was a lot of limitation for the option one. I'm going through it very quickly. Sorry for that, but it's just for the sake of time. John?
Yeah. So my understanding of this proposal, to just kind of summarize it, was that it kind of makes a little more flexibility in the API, where you have you model a pod group, and so there's policy that is attached to a pod group that applies to pods within that group, like these, and then you model a collection of those in the workload, and then you can apply policy across those collections in the workload, and so it gives you a little more expressiveness around those things. And I think my main what I haven't seen, Eric and Wojciech, I don't know if Wojciech's there, but maybe I've just missed it, is I'd really love to see what Heba's done here with every different workload controller, and seeing what it's going to look like with each of these APIs. And I think this discussion happened on Slack as well, and it sounded like everybody was Wojciech had the same thought, right? So, but I just wanted to that's something I'm hoping I think will help us figure out the right approach here.
Yeah, actually, this this exercise what led to all the options I stated now, because the more I try to integrate the workload with each one of these APIs, the more blocks or things I figured that we need to we need to have this. We need to have this field. So it was really good exercise, and to allow me to understand how we can integrate it in an easy way, also, not only how to integrate it. So in this pattern, we can have the pod group template. The pod group template will, the user can define it, or we can automatically define it from the workload, the true workload behavior, like as a default one. And then if the user wanted to override the one that we already created, they can override the pod group, similar to the DRA. I think we have the same concept I'm talking about in the DRA right now. Either somehow it's like either to specify your template or to create your own resource claim. So some sort of that. Andre?
Yes, sorry, I know over time, but just kind of high-level question. So this proposal is orthogonal to rename workload to workload class, right? Because I kind of like probably I miss out something.
Which proposal?
So this proposal, like where we have this API with resource claim templates and override replica configs, so this proposal will require for controls to create workload object, right, on every job submission.
We can, yeah. It's like we can have a default.
Okay.
John?
It's not. I think what Andre's asking is, in the previous discussion, you were saying we'd make workload like a static class. In this case, it looks like it's got a status and it's not a static class. It's more similar.
Exactly. Yeah. The option one, the user has to create it. There is no other way. But for the option two, you have the option to override the default one, and we can create the default one for each workload.
I mean, from my perspective,
type of true workload.
There are definitely additional additional functionality will require for subgroups and pod groups, right?
Yes.
The problem is we don't even, discuss now the subgroups. Like maybe we should learn something again from Q, that the question that asked to you in the chat, because Q has a concept of gangs, right? And I know Q has also the concept of workload inside. So understanding how they structure the subgroups and what policies are required for different use cases might be useful for us to also build this. I don't know.
Actually, I thought about group sets. So I introduce it here as well. So, but I don't want it to go through it. You can read it here. But actually, I went through it. I applied it, and like a couple of other use cases as well. So please go ahead, and let me know your feedback about it. Because it might be like a good thing. So in case if we want it like a bot group set, the bot group set can be will be created automatically according to the workload definition, but you can override it in the bot group if you want. I will stop because I feel like I dominated the meeting. Sorry for that, Kevin.
So I guess I'm unclear on why does the focus on having the pod group be a separate runtime class? Like when you model the API with a workload, like we have the pod group list, and like why couldn't we just put this information in the workload API and not have the pod group as a separate like CR? Because like it looks like your status is going to the workload status anyway.
No, actually no. In post proposals, in post proposals, actually, the status for the workload in the second option, the status here is just a summary, okay, a summary for everything, just a summary. But the pod group status, which is really it might be large, and it might take it's a little bit complicated. It will be related to this specific pod group.
But yeah, I guess. Yeah, sorry. Go on.
Go.
Oh no, sorry.
I just like, I mean, for me, it looks similar to job set status, right? Like, like we're also grouping the jobs under replicated jobs. So, yeah, I mean, I kind of like agree with Kevin. Like, I don't know if there are still some. Do we really need to have a pod group as a separate API? The question is, right?
So
Like,
yeah, my opinion is by having the workload as simple as we can, we can like allow user to create it, and we can get a lot of benefits actually from having it very simple at that, because this is all what the user need to know about our APIs, right? They don't have to go through the pod group details and set all these like information that we wanted to know, or like the controller needs to know to form the groups. It's not needed. If they need it, if they need to go through it, they can. But at least like we don't have to. We don't have to go through the replicas and like all this. I feel like it's too much details. But and of course the status, it's really complicated if we have it in one API. And the last thing is, again, the bot group is just about runtime, or it's like implementation details, to be honest. I feel like why we have it in the API itself. But this is my opinion. Eric?
So the two things I like about the just focusing on the proposal to have pod group be a separate resource. I think the thing I like about not doing it is that we keep our momentum, and we can like go to beta next release. We beta workload as is, and some workloads definitely can make use of it, and people get to use it sooner. So that's the good thing about no changes. And the good thing about making pod group be an additional resource is that for very large leader worker sets, you might run out of space inside the workload, and the nested status gets very messy. So those are kind of some good things there. And the life cycle of the workload, well, I don't think the life's like, but then you start going down. If you go take that to logical stream, and you have like workload set, workload, pod group set, pod group, pod subgroup, pod set, pod subset, like no one's going to adopt it if there's like they have to learn tense concepts. So there has to be some balance between like modeling the problem perfectly and delivering something to our users in the next year. And the job of modeling the problem, business logic perfectly, is the job of the controller. We're not trying to put controllers out of business. We're trying to ask them to give us the least amount of information that lets us do smart scheduling stuff. So that's happy to see changes to the original design. They should be motivated in like definitely better scheduling behavior, not perfect object modeling.
Yeah. I just want to quickly say, I mean, I think also the motivation behind separating per groups was, as you mentioned, about lifecycle, right? Which means like once we start representing more complex workloads, when we like whether it's Argo workflow or like reinforcement learning, maybe some inference pipelines, which right now we don't know about, like what will happen next year, right? So things become more complex, and I would kind of suspect like the life cycle of the steps might be very different, which we don't know right now, right? The thing is like, the separation of resource might give us opportunity in the future, right, to extend for some more complex use cases. Yeah.
But
I think the exercise though is
real quick thought there, John. We have to make the current top resources work, job, right? Kubeflow. But the next round of resources that have new controllers, they'll build on what they have. So it's so like they'll find ways to misuse what we've built. And we don't have to make their coding problem optimal. But yeah.
I just want to say, I want to make sure that we do go through yes, we don't have to model the problem perfectly to put the controllers out of business, but we also don't want to make their lives extraordinarily difficult or impossible, where the controller authors have to understand intricacies or like almost special cases of how we've coded things, right? Like we should have clear concepts that they can use, clear APIs, lower level APIs that they can use that behave in predictable ways. Like that's So it's there's a balance, right? And I don't know what it is yet, but like the way we're going to find out is to go through each of these controllers and take the lower level APIs and say how they're going to use it and whether they can do what they need to do with it or not.
I mean, if we were to stay on the schedule of taking what's in 135 and then going to GA 36, 37, that's optimistic. And then we introduce a new thing like pod subgroup and a few other things. Those start like another quarter from now. Now we're like 5 release cycles out. AI moves so fast that like, how can you be designing something which like doesn't really land for a year and a half? Like
I know,
the risk of irrelevance, I feel like, is greater than the risk of like building something that has to be replaced later.
If the question is, do they already have solutions in things like Q that are over the top of what's already there? They're just harder than we want. Like, so one 4-month release cycle is a lot, right? But it's also, if they already have solutions, it's sort of like we're not really preventing usage of Kubernetes. We're just making it a little bit messier for a little bit longer before we get it to be better. So I don't know. I mean, that's a judgment call, right? I don't know what the right decision is there. But going to beta is not an easily reversed decision. Alpha we can throw away and start over. Once we're in beta, it's a lot more painful.
One more thing before handing back to Dominic. I can see the pod group. It's like the controller, like this is our API that controller can just implement as much, whatever they want, the pod group. But the workload API is the bare minimum contract between the scheduler and the true workload. This is like the bare minimum requirement that both of them, they need to know, or they need to map, or they need to have it as a template. Okay, so they can know what they need from each other. But the pod group, it's totally up to the controller. It will be owned by them. The whole life cycle will be owned by them. This is what I envision the solution, and this is why the separation might help. Dominic.
So the good thing is that we may need this separation of concepts to have a good place to put a status, because if we have a lot of like gang replicas, then we want to have separate object to put a separate status regarding them, instead of putting everything into workload object, single workload object. So status for 100 gangs. But on the other hand, we not necessarily need that status really now. So we don't have currently status at all. And I think we can still move forward. It would be good to have status somewhere, but as an optimization. So it would be good to know like what we are going to do to not block the workload API graduation. If we agree that we will need to have separate runtime pod group, then we need to treat pod group in workload API as a template. And we have to be aware of it. And that should be sufficient for us for today. It would be good to have runtime pod groups and status there and address the lifetime problem for resource claims, for instance. But it is something not necessarily we have to have for today.
Totally agree. I think these are like 3 different, work streams that can happen together, in parallel, and it shouldn't, block, the work for each other. So how the workload, actually the status depends on how the workload will look like, because I have a document right now for the design, but I'm pretty sure everything will be just like written from scratch once we have the workload API, the final design. But the resource claim, it's different. It's totally, like not related and shouldn't be blocker actually.
But I would definitely just focus on this problem, whether we want to have runtime or not.
This is the first thing.
That's the only problem that we need to answer as soon as possible.
Exactly, I agree with you. This is the first thing that we need to have or agree on. Kevin?
Yeah, I was gonna say, as I'm playing around with like workload in job set and playing around with job, like not having a status makes this really hard to like actually understand what's going on. Like, from if I'm playing around in kind, I can look at the cube scheduler logs, but for most managed services, I don't expect people, they probably are not able to check those logs. And so like we need something that says, like, if it's either on like the pod, like an event that's saying why something's not getting scheduled, I think that would be pretty important for the workload.
So for now, the plan is to have the status in each pod separately. That's super inefficient, but at least it gives the bare minimum observability.
And that will be what for is beta. So I mean that's fine as long as there's some kind of information other than I think going to the cube scheduler logs, which I think
So the putting status on pod group instead of replicating the same status in each pod will be definitely a great optimization in terms of how API how load we put on API server, but I would treat it as an optimization. So bare minimum is to have the status in pod. Once we know.
What I'm wondering though is, at least when I think of like something like Q, our general stance was like the workload object in Q was a good way to describe like understanding like what's going on with the scheduling of all the pod sets. And so in this case, we're saying it really like you still go to the pod to understand why you're not getting scheduled, but there's nothing that's really notifying you in the process of the full gang if we're not putting it in the workload at the moment, right? Like it would just say each pod is being scheduled, but we don't have anything that's clearly like as an aggregate, can all these pods be placed together? Because we're not going to put that information into the workload status, it sounds like.
Sure, we will put it, but currently the problem is that we don't know whether we need to put it into workload objects or new pod group runtime objects. So this is why we need to have this decision.
Yeah, how can we make this decision as fast as we can? John, Eric, Dominic, how can we make this happen? Is it like we're reviewing lots of proposals right now, but how can we make it happen?
So Dominic, I know that we talked about this today. Can you say when Matt's going to share his thoughts?
Exactly. So we are exactly working on it, but just on this problem. Just on
we need to be open about our thoughts there, I think, so that because the community is blocked on our deliberation.
Right. I asked right before the meeting to Matt to share his document, but unfortunately he haven't read the message. So this is a completely very fresh new topic. So, but I think this is what I wrote in this document, that in my comment that we are working just on that piece. So not adding any other templates. Sorry, actually we do templates, but any new structure and so on. Just
So your proposal was a new core resource called pod group is added. Well, there's a bunch of proposals, but one of them was there's a new top level resource called pod group added, and the pod groups field of workload is renamed to pod group templates.
So exactly like in Heba proposal.
Yeah. So I think someone else in parallel, as you've been writing this, has been thinking about the same thing. So as soon as possible, we should merge your thankfully open proposal with this other one.
Yes,
so
that's not really
I think the path is what Wojciech and what we all discussed in Slack, which is like let's put down the proposals, let's do the pros and cons of each. And it sounds like, I mean, there might be some we're already like dismissing, right? In which case, how thoroughly do we have to do it? But part of that process, in my opinion, needs to be going through with the most important workload controllers and making sure, and use cases, and making sure that expressing their requirements on these things isn't like an enormous headache with whatever we come up with.
And we got to document the life, because as soon as you decouple them, the life cycle changes, right? What does it mean to delete one pod group of a multi-pod group workload? I think it means that until if the scheduler doesn't take any action on those pods, until it doesn't change anything until it sees another replacement pod group, but like that probably needs to be spelled out in detail.
I tried my best to do this actually here.
Where?
Okay, yeah, it's
okay.
Nice. Yeah, it's the life cycle here, and this is for option 2, which I actually like more than option 1. But it's, again, I try to do the trade-off as John mentioned. So yeah, I did. I just added it today because like everything is moving so fast. I added it today, and actually I'm adding another analysis for the integration from the true controller's point of view perspective. For each one of these options. I'm going through them now. And also, sorry for that. For option 1, because I had more time, I went through it, and I analyzed it for the DRA integration as well, and the preemption lifecycle as well. If you see the option 2 as is suitable, or can be an option, I can do the same for option 2 as well, because option P. Sorry, option P. Yeah. If you see it's it might be a good proposal, I can do the same, detailed as I did for option A for option P as well. But just let me know so I can go ahead, Andre.
Yeah, sorry, just a quick question, to Dominic and Eric, on the proposal that we're preparing, also gathering the feedback from Habit's proposal, do we need to think about any of those kind of subgroup or pod sets discussions, so it will happen eventually in the future once we have this pod group CR? Because I was thinking about,
I have it here in option P.
Yeah, I know we have it here, but this new proposal, will we take this into consideration? Because Q already has it. My question is do we need to think about it right now, or it can come later, right?
So an observation for your evaluation is that Q does not have separate objects. It puts all the workload in one object, and they've gotten pretty far with that. So, and by making a pod group, there's even a hope that maybe Q could have a very simple converter between Q workload and core and scheduling workload. When you start denormalizing or normalizing whatever the data, then I guess it's a little harder for Q to maintain some kind of compatibility. I don't know if Matt thought about that, Dominic.
Yeah, I think my only point is here, on if we really think about adoption, and I think we discussed today working on budget eventually, Q will integrate with Workload API. So we really need to take seriously those use cases that Q already has, right? And customers already run this in production. So we need to understand that in the future, Q as the resource quota allocation, multi-cluster will reuse our, CRD for the orchestration. So this is just my suggestion to think about that.
Okay, but how I read your suggestion is that whether we should think about how bigger hierarchy of group of groups and so on at this point. At the same time, we think about introducing a separate runtime object.
What I thought Andre said was whether we're going to split them out or not, we need to add pod subgroups and indices soon,
Yeah,
right?
and no, we don't need to add them right now, right? We just at least need to make sure API in the future allow us, right, to extend it.
Yeah.
And which means
Well,
like if we go to, yeah, good.
So I think the Eric proposal described in the document was already doing that.
Okay.
Is that correct, Eric?
I mean,
Is that my
I
understanding?
I thought it covered a lot of use cases and was complete, but I mean, there's a lot more brains here, so it'd be great to have more eyes on that.
So on one hand, I think we don't want to be blocked at the moment with this describing this hierarchy yet. But I think your voice might be also important here. We definitely don't want to go into direction in which we are blocked and we cannot model some elements. So I believe Wojtek is thinking about all those stuff as well.
I mean, if we go ahead with pod subgroups in the future, in the future we can introduce, like pod subgroups here, right? Which and pod groups can group them, right? And we can think about it in the future. I just think that pod group gives us some, opportunities in the future, right? As a separate resource to extend this to some more kind of complex orchestration, which require for disaggregated serving that the one that Roman was mentioned, right? Which is essential, right? To group those leaders and workers in the same gang, but both of them will be in a different rack, require different resource claims. So I feel like we can support it, right? In the future.
But separating the pod groups might also introduce some challenges because you might want to add some new constraints that we don't have today, like topology constraint that will place several pod groups in some topology domain, or the opposite, spread them between different topology domains. And then I'm not sure, maybe it's probably possible, but maybe separating the pod groups will make it harder to express those constraints. While in the same API, the workload, it might be easier.
Or it might use the scheduler affinity, thing that we start to think about. Maybe, I don't know.
I think it's more than that, right? You don't only want them to be gang scheduled together, but you also want them to have a specific to be scheduled within a specific topology domain. So it becomes not only a slice of podgroups names, but also some sort of a structure where you want to add this constraint.
Right. So, like, I can say like what I think personally, that like I was initially thinking about making the whole structure more flexible, that we can model theoretically things that we don't know yet. But there are also other opinions about that, and I think we are following those different opinions about that things have to be more structured, more constrained. But I think Eric can say more about that.
Okay. So time check here. Let's try to have like 5 minutes trying to get like action items here for the next meeting.
Yeah.
So what is the next step, Dominic and Eric? Are we going to have just one document for the community, having the options with the trade-off analysis and the integration analysis as well? Is that like a good plan? Or what do you think?
So one thing that I don't know if anyone's looked at what I've done, but like I did have like a POC with JobSet working with our workload API as is, and I also did the same with the job controller, getting those working. I don't know if it would be helpful to maybe give an overview of because like what I'm struggling with is like a lot of my cases for a workload are pretty well satisfied with what we have currently, and I still don't like. I know there's some questions, especially from leader worker set, around the preemption of the workers and the leaders, which I think is an important problem to solve. But at least from like a workload scheduling perspective, we're pretty far with the API that we have. And I know it sounds like, I don't know if John dropped, but I know he was mentioning like getting more input from like the workload authors maybe could be helpful. Like I'm happy to whatever next call we have to like walk through like the POC I've done with the job controller and job set. And that could be, I mean, for me, that's one thing I was thinking to do at this call, but obviously we did not get to that. So, but that could be one thing, or because like, I'm still, I mean, it sounds like from the workload author perspective, I don't think I'm going to make much progress on this right now with the API in flight as is. And I mean, we could also decide on the workload API, and then in 1.36, we consider integrating with workload controllers if it's really going to change this much.
You're saying you're going to lose interest in your POC project if you find out that we're just going to spin with redesign after redesign.
Well, part of what I was thinking about is that, yeah, I mean, basically for job, I don't think there's any way we're going to get this in the job controller with the API in flux as is. Like job API is V1. I was thinking for job set, we could iterate with something, but if I'm not even sure with the pod group, like the controller needs to create a pod group or needs to create a workload. In my eyes, I don't even think I want a user caring about a workload or a pod group. I just want them to create like job set and it's gang scheduled. Like it shouldn't matter like what I'm creating, but like I worry like as a workload controller, I don't know what we need to create to get this to work.
I mean, the lesson I took from Q is their API is a little bit messy, but they've been able to evolve to add new concepts. All the concepts we talked about, like they've mostly been able to add them. So I don't think there's that much risk we're going to build something we cannot do something with. Like in the history of Kubernetes, we have fixed all the API problems we've had by adding new fields and adding new objects. So I think I don't want to be in a situation where we like design something that covers every known AI use case, and then we work for 2 to 3 release cycles to deliver it, and then AI has moved on substantially from that. I want to get the foot in the door so that now the next controller that gets written tries to use what we have and gives us direct feedback rather than not even being in the conversation with the controller writers.
I think we are in a good place that if we agreed on, like the final workload API design, we can implement at least one controller to get integrated with it as an alpha in this release. So we can like have like a big jump once we agree on the workload API, hopefully. Okay, so what's the next step? Because I think we are, yeah.
I guess like Dominic and Eric, you will share the proposal. I think we also continue to review your proposal and also the pod group if there are any additional questions there, right? And I think we're going to meet, I think, next week, right?
Next week is unfortunately it's off, so we will meet on not next Monday, but the next Monday, the after one.
Well, we will have sig-scheduling, I think.
This is a good opportunity as well. Yes.
Next week. Yeah. Yes, I think we should, have of course, merge into one design, which considers introducing runtime objects for holding status. And from what I hear, at the same time, we should think about like the structure, like enriching the workload definition structure. Those two are correlated. We have to know that the separation will make sense in the context of enriching the structure. And I think from what we hear, like we should start discussing enriching the structure as well as soon as possible. Eric, is this your understanding as well, or a good action item?
I don't want to change the structure more because I think the risk of getting something, I don't see the value in it. But
maybe
you want to discuss
Yeah.
the changes? We should, as community, discuss them.
No, I was not talking about changing the.
Okay.
Considering
I'm out next week, so I can't really contribute to getting ready. Hopefully, Matt can share and align with Heba. I'm not here next week.
I fear not talking about changing the current structure. The workload API as a template probably will definitely remain. Like,
okay, I mean, yeah, I think it's clear my preference is to like favor moving forward over reconsidering design, because I do think I agree with Kevin that you can get really far with what we have, but I don't know what the community consensus process is.
No. I'm not saying reconsidering, just making sure how, like discussing how it may look in the future iterations to just not go into dead end, but yeah.
You're saying like, how can we, what will we be able to add in the future?
Yes.
Okay, so that got to like the hybrid. Are you alluding to the hybrid policy? Or do we not? I think we're out of time to talk about that.
I don't know what you mean, the hybrid
Okay.
policy.
So one of the proposals was to both support the current design and move that to beta, and optionally have the choice of there basically be like a pod groups, inline pod groups, and like a external pod groups. So you could either put the pod groups in the workload, or you could have them be external. And the main person who really needs them to be external, that's right, leader worker set is what driving all the like denormalization. Job set, they pretty much work fine with work group as one object because they're not used elastically that much today, and there's no ambiguity about whether a pod group is replicated or not. It's really leader worker set to me that's driving it, and so we could sort of have a GA, like a beta next release for everybody but leader worker set, and then kind of wait to do external pod group to support leader worker set better. And so then that was another option that we should consider.
Yes.
I will not have time to like. You've seen. Let's talk tomorrow about how soon we can share the other docs we have.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you for like staying that long. And I believe we will see everyone in sig-scheduling and then on Monday.
Thanks for bringing up so many good points and bringing the community together for a good discussion. I appreciate it. Even though I disagreed with some of the things, like I'm very glad that you're holding this.
Of course, we're here to like to agree and disagree sometimes. Of course. Thank you so much.
Night.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.